Ferocious bombings are hitting the Japanese islands, and those soldiers of the Imperial Army, who committed some of the greatest atrocities of World War II, are now the victims of the most brutal massacres. The United States forces have landed in full force, and the battlefield in the Pacific is stained red by the blood of the members of the Axis. Hundreds of thousands of combatants are being killed by the Allied onslaught, but they refuse to surrender. On the contrary, they develop strategies where they do not care about dying and only want to drag as many enemies as possible with kamikaze flights. However, deep down they know that the end will soon come. The terrible American massacres are increasing. As if that were not enough, not only are they taking revenge for the attack on Pearl Harbor, but they are about to write the most gruesome page in the history of war with the use of nuclear bombs. In this new video, we will review the last and cruelest battles of the war, which took place on Japanese soil. Get ready, because we will relive the most brutal scenes in full color.
How could Japan be defeated without a terrible loss of American life? The country would eventually turn to the most powerful and dreadful weapon ever seen. A weapon that would change the course of war forever.
December 7th, 1941 was not just another date in the history of World War II. Shortly before 8 a.m. on that day, 353 Japanese aircraft that had taken off from the Imperial Navy's aircraft carriers attacked the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The military offensive damaged 8 battleships, 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, a training ship, and a mine layer. In addition, 188 aircraft were lost, and more than 2,400 people died. The objective was to prevent the American fleet from being able to intervene in the actions of the Japanese forces in Southeast Asia, and at first, it seemed to have succeeded. The success of the preventive maneuver allowed the Japanese to advance at will in the Pacific for 6 months following the attack, conquering the overseas possessions of the United Kingdom, France, the Netherlands, and the Americans themselves. They managed to occupy Wake Island, Malaysia, Hong Kong, Singapore, and in March 1942, forced General Douglas MacArthur to evacuate the Philippines. A month later, the outlook looked even bleaker for Washington when the Japanese forced 75,000 starving and sick Allied prisoners of war to walk some 100 kilometers in the most horrendous conditions, in scorching heat and with little food or water during the Bataan Death March. The American prospects after entering the global conflict were not the best, but the hope of giving battle received a boost thanks to Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, who led a fleet of 16 B-25 planes to bomb targets in Japan. These attacks did not mean a defeat per se for the Imperial Army, but they did send a clear message: the United States was in the fight. The turning point was probably the Battle of Midway, which took place on June 4th to 5th, 1942. There, the Japanese lost 4 precious aircraft carriers to the American Navy. It was the beginning of Allied dominance. The next crucial step came 2 months later, on August 7th, when the 1st Marine Division invaded Guadalcanal. That battle lasted almost 8 months and combined sea, land, and air forces in a joint effort for the first time in history. Another major defeat for Japan. In Washington, they began to look at the Pacific with different eyes. By October 1944, 2.5 years after leaving Bataan, General MacArthur returned to the Philippines. And by November, there was reason to believe that the tide of war was decidedly in favor of the United States. However, the Japanese proved to be fierce fighters, and surrender did not seem an option for them. They would fight to the last man in a brutal way. This is how we arrive at the mythical island of Iwo Jima, where the most fearsome chapters of an announced end would begin. Join us to see this unpublished material in color of the conflict.
Wave after wave of American aircraft paved the way with a massive aerial bombardment. Then, On the morning of February the 19th, 1945, the guns of the Naval Task Force began one of the most prolonged bombardments of the war. At the same time, landing craft set off for the shore.
This is how American forces reached the islands. The invasion was related to a tactical necessity, since despite having bases safely established in the Mariana Islands, the distance of 1,900 kilometers from Japan meant that the crews of the B-29 bombers were abandoned at sea in case of serious damage. For this reason, attention focused on the small island of Iwo Jima, halfway between the current bases and the objective. American planners recognized the strategic importance of the place, which at that time was used by the Imperial forces as an early warning station against imminent air attacks against Japanese cities. If they managed to conquer this portion of land, the Americans would have airfields for emergency landings, but it would also be a position to group the escorts of P-51 fighters or ground support systems to protect the naval fleets in the waters of the area. However, achieving this would not be an easy mission. Japan's commanders knew the strategic value of Iwo Jima, which is why Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had been appointed to command the island in May 1944. Experienced and ruthless, this military leader had spent several years in the United States conducting research and knew his forces very well. From then on, local forces began to build elaborate defenses, making the best possible use of resources such as natural caves and rocky, uneven terrain. The entire territory was transformed into a vast network of bunkers, hidden weapons, and underground passages leading from one strong point to another. Large chambers, some up to 5 stories deep, were made to serve as storage areas and hospitals with thick walls and reinforced concrete ceilings. Landing zones were also concealed, most often by covering them with sand and carefully camouflaged. And for defense, the same was done with the 120mm guns placed so that they could direct their fire toward the beaches where the enemy would land. Other smaller caliber artillery pieces were hidden throughout the island, as well as anti-aircraft systems and mortars. The Japanese were determined to make the Americans pay a high price for Iwo Jima and were prepared to defend it to the death. Now the time for planning was over, and it was time for action. Japanese planes based on the island were able to attack the B-29s on their bombing missions and even made sorties on the installations in the Marianas. However, American troops had managed to get ashore, and long weeks of brutal fighting were about to begin.
For 3 days, Marines clawed their way up the steep, pitted slopes. They were supported by a constant air and naval bombardment from the invasion fleet.
The American operation to capture the island involved 3 Marine divisions of the 5th Amphibious Corps, totaling 70,647 men under the command of Holland Smith. The intense bombardment prior to the landing only drove the Japanese underground, rendering their positions invulnerable to enemy fire. In fact, the concealed weapons survived the attack with virtually no losses. On the morning of the American deployment, some 30,000 men began advancing up the southeast coast near Mount Suribachi, where most of Iwo Jima's defenses were concentrated. As soon as the Marines moved inland, they found themselves under devastating machine gun and artillery fire. By the end of the day, they had made it to the west coast, but their losses were certain. Nearly 2,000 combatants had been killed or wounded. Nevertheless, the American forces were determined to accomplish their mission despite the great challenge it posed. Fighting in such inhospitable terrain made progress difficult, and as if that weren't enough, they were forced to dig to reach the network of underground tunnels where the Japanese were entrenched. However, when they did manage to reach these positions, They showed no mercy to their rivals. The slaughter was brutal and bloody, on par with what the Japanese proposed. Kuribayashi knew they could not win the battle, but he hoped to inflict such costly casualties that they would slow the American advance on Japan and perhaps give him bargaining power. On February 23rd, the 28th Marine Regiment finally reached the top of Mount Suribachi, prompting a famous photograph raising the flag on Iwo Jima, often cited as the most reproduced ever and the representation of the Pacific War.
The next day, the Marines captured the first of the island's strategically vital airfields. But Kuribayashi had told his men to take as many of the enemy with them as possible. Their duty to the Emperor to die on the island.
Despite any orders from the commander, the U.S. troops were relentless. During the rest of February, they advanced northwards, and by 1st March, they had taken 2/3 of the island. However, it was not until the 26th of that month that the territory was fully secured. Iwo Jima was one of the bloodiest battles fought during the Pacific War. American casualties were 6,821 dead and 19,207 wounded. Japanese losses amounted to more than 20,000 men killed, and only 1,083 combatants survived, becoming prisoners. However, this was not the only chapter in this confrontation between the two forces at the end of the war. In fact, it was rather the preamble to the most savage and merciless duel that had the Americans and Japanese as protagonists. We are talking about the capture of the Ryukyus Islands, and particularly the capture of Okinawa. The latter was the largest island in the archipelago, located 550 kilometers from Kyushu, one of Japan's main territories. Gaining control of it would provide air bases to intensify the aerial bombardment that the United States had been developing against its enemy, and to provide direct support from land to the invasion that continued to advance ever closer to the capital of the empire. The islands that were conquered could also allow the Japanese shipping blockade to be reinforced and be used as a staging area for supplies for any invasion of the main target. For that reason, it was a prized objective for Washington. However, the local troops were not willing to give them up without spilling every last drop of blood. The forces defending Okinawa were under the command of Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, and unlike the little more than 20,000 men on Iwo Jima, there were nearly 100,000 combatants on this island territory, in addition to thousands of civilians who were not happy with the arrival of the Americans. Faced with this, the Americans prepared 7 divisions for the operation, 4 from the Army and 3 from the Marines. In total, there were 183,000 soldiers ready for battle, and in order to prevent the Japanese from gaining reinforcements, the British Pacific Fleet guarded the airfields and had orders to attack if necessary. Everything was ready, and to replicate the success that had been achieved at Iwo Jima, the action began in the same way, with deadly bombs falling in droves from the sky.
The opening bombardment of Okinawa began on March the 23rd, 1945. It lasted for a whole week. Finally, on the morning of April the 1st, the assault boats headed for the shore.
The beaches at Hagushi were the first contact for Allied fighters, who met with little resistance as they landed. The Japanese had decided to meet the Americans further inland, thus staying out of range of naval gunfire. Some 60,000 U.S. troops landed during the initial raid, seizing 2 airfields near the coasts before advancing through a narrow path leading to the center of the island. The following days continued in relative calm and without major challenges, but you could sense in the air that was about to change. The first major Japanese counterattack came on the 6th and 7th of April. The Imperial Army had learned the cost of facing Washington's forces, and they did not mind dying as long as they could cause great damage to their enemies. This led to a significant involvement of kamikaze aircraft. These were squadrons of suicide pilots who flew their Zero fighters to their targets, armed with bombs weighing several hundred kilos to cause as much destruction as possible. They were generally young soldiers, between 25 and 35 years old, but sometimes even 17-year-olds were enlisted. For all of them, it was an honor to give their lives for their country, even though the high command knew that sacrificing them only served to delay an inevitable defeat. The kamikaze attack was complemented by a naval operation that was called Tengo. The battleship Yamato, the light cruiser Yahagi, and 8 destroyers were assembled as bait to attract as many American aircraft carriers as possible. These ships also played a suicidal role, as they would end up in the middle of the explosions to degrade the maritime strength of their enemy. As a result of the Japanese fuel shortage, the Yamato only had enough to reach Okinawa. Off the coast, it was planned to beach the battleship and use its 46-centimeter guns to support the fighting on the island. After being spotted by an American submarine and reconnaissance plane, naval attack planes sank 6 of Japan's ships without suffering any losses. The strategy had failed, and the Americans continued to slaughter the opposing forces.
For 10 days, the Japanese held their defensive line. Then, when they could hold out no longer, they simply withdrew to the next defensive position and continued to resist all over again.
While massive kamikaze attacks intensified with more than 5,000 Japanese sorties, in the northern part of Okinawa, the U.S. troops met only light opposition, and the area was captured within 2 weeks. However, Japan's main defenses were in the south. There was fierce fighting against well-entrenched forces, and although the Americans were able to advance, shedding a great deal of blood along the way, they did so very slowly. The slaughter was brutal, but that did not succeed in subduing the local fighters. Several more weeks passed until Shuri Castle, the center of Japanese resistance, was captured on 29th May. This represented a strategic as well as a psychological blow. Little by little, the Imperial Army fell. Organized opposition held out until 21st June, and from that moment on, many of the Japanese soldiers abandoned their posts and tried to hide on their own. However, they were eventually found by the enemy, who tore them apart mercilessly. The campaign was not declared over until July 2nd, 3 months after the landing. This was much longer than the Americans had expected, and it also came at a higher cost. Still, the Allies were encouraged by the success, which ended the battle for Okinawa with 12,520 dead or missing and 36,631 wounded. The Japanese had managed to skillfully use the terrain to their advantage to inflict the greatest damage. However, the brutal assault resulted in almost 95% of Japan's soldiers being killed. The total number of casualties exceeded 110,000, to which were added some 7,400 prisoners of war. The ferocity of the Imperial forces' defense made the fighting on these 2 islands terrible in terms of casualties for both sides. Furthermore, this resistance was a sign that the idea of surrender was not in the plans. The United States did not want to continue losing its troops in this way, so it had to think of another strategy to invade Japanese territory.
The victory at Okinawa meant America's military planners now had to decide what to do next. Despite shattering defeats, the Japanese still showed no sign of surrendering. Some US commanders argued for a continuation of the firebombing campaign. But by the summer of 1945, it was clear that bombing alone would never defeat Japan. An invasion seemed unavoidable. But the question was, at what price?
General Curtis LeMay's B-29s had showered Japanese cities with napalm bombs, a high-tech incendiary jelly that destroyed 25 square kilometers of Tokyo in less than 3 hours. However, the stakes had to be higher, and the world would learn about the most fearsome weapon ever invented. Its development had begun several years ago, and the goal was to build it before the Germans or the entire planet would fall to the Nazis. Now, with the Third Reich defeated, authorities in Washington were debating whether this terrifying piece of weaponry was what was needed for the Japanese surrender. The answer to that question is today one of the most devastating milestones in history. It came on August 6, 1945, when the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima in the first nuclear attack of all time. In a press release issued after the attack, President Harry Truman warned Japan to surrender or expect a rain of ruin from the air such as has never been seen on this earth. He was not lying. On August 9th, the second bombing of Nagasaki took place. Between 140,000 to 240,000 people died as a direct result of these two attacks, and many more have suffered the consequences in the following years due to exposure to radiation. A day later, the Japanese government authorities asked Emperor Hirohito for the country's surrender, since he was the one who had to make the final decision, and he accepted it, leaving a grim message. If we continue to fight, it would not only result in a final collapse and destruction of the Japanese nation, but would also lead to the total extinction of human civilization. August 14th is considered the end of the Pacific War, the brutal chapter that culminated in an equally cruel and bloody war. In June 1942, an atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean became the stage for one of the most brutal and significant battles of the entire Second World War. At Midway, the American and Japanese fronts clashed, staining the oceanic waters with blood and molten metal. After 3 days, nearly 3,500 people had perished in one of the most astonishing humiliations suffered by the Japanese Empire. In this installment of military history, we invite you to enter that hell wearing the uniform of the Japanese Navy to understand how that battle unfolded from their perspective. Sunken aircraft carriers, downed ships, and thousands of lives extinguished. How was it possible? Today, we will find out. Before the Second World War, the Empire of Japan presented itself to the world as an invincible power. Japanese troops had defeated on several occasions the countries that would form the Allied bloc, thus demonstrating their tactical and material superiority. These victories allowed the small island to conquer Hong Kong, Shanghai, Malaysia, Singapore, Burma, New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and countless nearby territories. All this expansionist zeal was summarized in a concept created and promoted by imperial authorities, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Essentially, it represented the dream of creating a bloc similar to the Soviet Union, but with Asian nations that would be led by Japan to finally liberate themselves from European influence. From the Japanese island, they felt that their military superiority also translated into racial superiority. They believed that portion of the planet belonged to Japan by right, echoing the idea of Nazi living space. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese Admiralty carried out an operation that changed history. That morning, Pearl Harbor was attacked by a number of bombers never before seen, turning the American base into a floating inferno. The images captured during that day circled the globe, and as President Franklin Delano Roosevelt described it, that would be a date which will live in infamy.
Here is the actual bombing of the mighty USS Arizona by Jap planes. These pictures were made by a fearless cameraman who thought nothing of his personal safety to make possible this record for all posterity. A single lucky hit was responsible for the disaster that befell the Arizona when a Jap bomb falling directly through one of the battleship's funnels exploded in the engine room and set ablaze tons of fuel oil.
The Japanese attack was intended as a preemptive action to prevent the intervention of the United States Pacific Fleet in the military actions planned by the Empire of Japan in Southeast Asia. However, the attack that dragged the United States into World War II was only partially successful. The large American aircraft carriers were not anchored in port as the Japanese had hoped, so their effort failed to destroy Uncle Sam's maritime projection capability. From one of those legendary aircraft carriers, the USS Hornet, 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers took off on April 18, 1942, and bombed the city of Tokyo, causing panic among the population. In May of the same year, the Americans used their carriers to thwart Japanese movements towards Australia during the Battle of the Coral Sea. The powerful American response convinced Japanese high command that they needed to strike at enemy aircraft carriers if they wanted to continue dreaming of total conquest of Southeast Asia. Let's hear the words of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo.
帝国の流体、東亜の荒廃、まさにこの一戦にあり、一億国民が一切を挙げて国に報い、国に準ずるの時は今であります。発行を家となす公募のもとに、この人中報告の大精神ある限り、英米といえども何ら恐るるに足らないのであります。
According to information provided by Japanese intelligence, the American aircraft carriers were sailing in waters near Midway Islands, an atoll located in the North Pacific, near the northwestern end of the Hawaiian archipelago. The name Midway refers to its geographical position, being halfway between America and Asia. With this in mind, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto proposed a risky theory. He believed that remaining on the defensive against a power with the industrial might and human resources of the United States would be suicidal. Therefore, he devised an offensive plan to be executed at this strategically valuable atoll. The concept was to cause such an impact that it would force the enemy to negotiate for peace, allowing Japan to retain the conquered lands. In mid-April 1942, the Japanese decided that their best option was to lure the American aircraft carriers to sink them all, and then take Midway with the aim of expanding their defensive perimeter in the Pacific. This operation was seen as preparation for invading Fiji and Samoa, as well as potentially advancing towards Hawaii. The occupation of the atoll, similar to the attack on Pearl Harbor, was not part of a campaign to conquer America, but rather aimed at eliminating the strategic power of the Americans in the Pacific Ocean. This would allow the Japanese a clear path to establish a significant sphere of political and economic influence in the region. Like all Japanese plans during World War II, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's plan was complex and based on certain assumptions. Firstly, from the Japanese perspective, the only available aircraft carriers to defend Midway were the USS Enterprise and the USS Hornet. The USS Lexington had been sunk, and they believed the USS Yorktown had suffered serious structural damage in the Battle of the Coral Sea. However, after quick repairs at Pearl Harbor, the Yorktown was back in action, unbeknownst to the Japanese. Even more significant was what the Japanese assumed about American morale. Japanese high command was convinced that their rival was demoralized and unmotivated due to their frequent defeats in the preceding 6 months. Yamamoto felt that frustration could be crucial in luring the Americans into a trap, driven by a desire for revenge at any cost, thus definitively compromising their naval and air power in the Pacific Ocean. To achieve this, Yamamoto planned to disperse his forces so they could not be discovered before the battle, and then converge on the enemy with surprise and concentrated force once the confrontation began. As we mentioned earlier, it was a complex plan, but if successful, It would be a death sentence for the United States. The reality was that the Japanese were very confident, perhaps overly so to the point of overlooking some fundamental issues. For instance, capturing Midway required an unprecedented amphibious assault operation. Up to that point, the Japanese Navy had only conducted such attacks in undefended or lightly defended areas. The atoll was a small territory, so it was certain that there would be American presence across the entirety of Midway, further complicating the landing. And that wasn't the only obstacle. There were also natural challenges standing between Japan and its imperial dreams. The atoll is surrounded by vast coral reefs, which are a deadly trap for any unprepared amphibious vessel. Even at high tide, the water depth was barely enough for Asian boats to cross the reef without suffering structural damage. This meant that the invasion would largely have to be conducted by air, placing excessive importance on the imperial aircraft carriers. The success or utter failure of the mission depended entirely on the performance of these ships, which proved to be a fatal decision. Let's return to the final days of April 1942, when the Japanese Admiralty was preparing its strategy.
The problem with the Japanese was that they had scattered their fleet over a very wide area. It was organised into component parts, none of which could support each other. So, in effect, as a total number, the Japanese outnumbered the Americans, but when it came to a face-to-face battle, they didn't.
In order to deceive the enemy, Yamamoto dispersed his ships so that all remained hidden before the battle. His group of battleships and supporting cruisers followed Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's aircraft carriers several hundred kilometers away. Their mission was to approach and destroy any elements that could defend Midway after being weakened by attacks from the aircraft carriers. What the Admiral did not know was that this tactic would prevent him from properly defending his positions, ultimately giving the advantage to the enemy. Even worse, something he could not have known was that American spies had managed to decipher the Japanese naval code and were able to translate several of their secret messages. But remember, today we will focus on the Japanese perspective of this legendary battle. On June 3, 1942, the Japanese attacked the Aleutian Islands as a diversionary maneuver, and the next day the Battle of Midway began. The Japanese fleet then headed towards Midway, consisting of 4 aircraft carriers, 9 battleships, 8 destroyers, 4 cruisers, and 433 combat aircraft. The Americans had 3 aircraft carriers, 8 cruisers, 15 destroyers, and 360 combat aircraft. These numbers serve to illustrate the magnitude of this confrontation in the far reaches of the Pacific. This is how Imperial pilot Harada Kaname remembered his experience before taking off.
ところがね、もう飛行機に乗ってみたらもうそこで海がすぐ近くで、果たしてこれは罹患できるかなというふうに思ったんですけども、もうそんなこと言ってる場合じゃないもんで、整備員にもしっかり捕まえてもらっていて、オーバーブーストまでやって、それで、走らせたらすぐもう脚を引っ込めの、操作をやりました。どうやら船から離れてザーッと進んでいって、これは落ちるかなと思ったら、それでもそこでフレークがついてどうやら上がりましたね。
The next day, in the early morning of June 4th, Japanese Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo launched a wave of 108 aircraft against Midway. At the same time, he deployed reconnaissance aircraft to locate the enemy fleet. Japanese Zero fighters managed to shoot down 17 American units that came out to confront them. Not a single Japanese aircraft was shot down. From that moment on, the Japanese bombed and strafed the atoll, destroying gasoline depots, seaplane hangars, observation towers, vehicles, and anti-aircraft artillery. Around 6:30 in the morning, Japanese aircraft carriers severely damaged the American base with a second wave of bombers. In the skies, aircraft from both sides fought fiercely, resulting in a large number of shoot-downs and explosions. As minutes passed, Uncle Sam's pilots began to gain the upper hand and forced the withdrawal of large Japanese air units.
Japanese planes were shot down by the score. One flew slap into this.
Of the 108 Japanese aircraft used in this initial advance on Midway, 11 were destroyed, 14 suffered severe damage, and another 29 required repairs. With these figures, and considering that American bombers could still use parts of the base to refuel and return to attack, the first wave was considered a failure. It was crucial to intensify hostilities if they intended to establish a foothold for a large-scale landing in the following days. The Japanese officer in charge of the operation, Joichi Tomonaga, communicated to Admiral Nagumo that it was necessary to launch a second raid to complete the destruction of the base. In the first attack on Midway, he had opted to equip reserve aircraft with torpedoes, fearing they might encounter American ships. Therefore, conducting a second offensive was essential, as the atoll's airstrip had not been destroyed due to the lack of ground bombs. All aircraft in the second wave, including reserve planes, were ordered to be armed with bombs to destroy the island's facilities, an order that proved fatal. The major problem was that replacing torpedoes would take a long time, at least half an hour per aircraft. In the midst of this process, a lagging Japanese cruiser delivered Nagumo the worst possible news. 10 enemy ships were heading towards Midway. Consumed by panic, Nagumo ordered all aircraft to be brought back up to the deck and the bombs to be exchanged for torpedoes, further wasting time in a battle where the clock was the main antagonist. It was then that some American ships detected the Japanese aircraft carriers at their most vulnerable moment, when the deck was filled with planes loaded with torpedoes. If these were destroyed, the resulting explosions could be devastating and potentially sink them to the bottom of the Pacific. And so it happened. The explosion of Japanese aircraft armed with torpedoes also ignited the fuel depots, causing the 3 hit aircraft carriers to sink. It was a devastating blow for the Japanese. Once again, let's hear the words of Harada Kanami.
だから我々は見たところがその下張ってくるんですよ、雷撃隊ね。これを盛んに攻撃やってたんですよね。そしたら上そのドントリスが来てるわけです。それを知らないんですよね。だから向こうの魚雷は一発も当たってないはずです。ところがその時に上にドントリスが来てて、このドントリスにうまく命中させられてしまって、ああいう大悲劇を受けたわけですよね。
Imagine you are a Japanese sailor who has been educated for years in the Japanese doctrine of military and racial superiority. Before departing for Midway, your superiors described to you a master plan designed to send the enemy's main ships to the bottom of the ocean, one of the great Western powers. Everything is on your side: geography, surprise, and the number of ships. The problem is that when the moment of combat arrives, in the blink of an eye, hundreds of your comrades are killed. Thousands more are stranded. Your nation's maritime strength burns in flames on the waves of the Pacific. It is truly difficult to comprehend the shock felt by the Japanese troops in the face of such a crushing and unexpected defeat. Admiral Nagumo had to make difficult decisions during the days of the Battle of Midway. According to Japanese naval doctrine, large-scale and organized aerial attacks were favored over deploying small numbers of aircraft to defend or attack specific points. The idea was to overwhelm the enemy with the quantity and intensity of the attack. However, to achieve this, accurate information about the enemy's positions and movements was crucial. Otherwise, you would be sending a powerful fleet to its demise. Lacking such information, Nagumo chose the doctrinal approach and held back a reserve of aircraft on the carriers until he could organize a large-scale launch. Many argue that if he had deployed the available force, they could have potentially sunk some of Washington's carriers. Of course, these are just speculations. History has already been written, and this particular one had a clear victor. The Hiryu, the only intact Japanese aircraft carrier, launched its planes against the USS Yorktown, causing serious damage. However, shortly after, The Hiryu was attacked by bombers from the Enterprise, leaving it severely damaged and sinking the next day. Upon being informed of the loss of all 4 carriers, Admiral Yamamoto gave the order to withdraw. On June 6th, during that retreat, American aircraft bombed the cruiser Mikuma, which sank with 650 sailors on board. The campaign that had presumed Japan's victory ended in one of its worst humiliations.
Now putting to sea with a U.S. Navy cameraman, we see a new chapter just released of the great American naval victory at Midway, the attack on the carrier Yorktown. Filmed under fire, the battle that cost the Japs 10 warships, 4 carriers, and nearly 300 planes. Damaged by direct hits, the gallant Yorktown steams on. Her flight deck ablaze, the crew calmly fights the flames as gunners keep up their withering barrage of anti-aircraft fire.
The Japanese lost 4 aircraft carriers, a cruiser, 250 aircraft, and 3,057 men, including sailors and pilots. These pilots were the most skilled and experienced in the Japanese Air Force. There was no doubt. The United States not only won, but also demonstrated that it was stronger than ever and willing to fight to the end to avenge what happened at Pearl Harbor. The significance of the battle on that small atoll cannot be underestimated. It was a turning point in World War II, with many attributing Japan's defeat in the Pacific to this failure, a viewpoint supported by strong arguments. Losing 4 out of their 6 aircraft carriers left Japan unable to pursue further conquests in Asia and the Pacific Ocean. After Midway, Japan lost military initiative and adopted a defensive posture, which its admirals had diagnosed as a serious mistake. For the first time in the war, the number of Japanese and American ships was equalized, with the advantage that American industry could build new aircraft carriers more quickly. In fact, by 1945, Washington managed to launch 35 aircraft carriers, while the Japanese barely compensated for those lost at Midway.
America is building freighters by day and night. Red-hot rivets and red-hot rivet catchers are on the job. They're turning out the ships, and the ships are delivering the goods.
The production capacity was central to what happened in the rest of the War of the Pacific. The American industrial machine was gearing up in 1942, and its products really started to come out in mass numbers in 1943.
Analyzing Japan's defeat from the perspective of its admirals and soldiers, it's possible to identify a factor that condemned the empire throughout the conflict: overconfidence and limitless imperialistic vision. Every Japanese man was convinced that their nation could defeat any army on the planet. At the same time, there was blind faith in the complicated military strategies of their officers, which relied not only on the capability of their men, but also on luck. Relying on fate and fortune is not uncommon in wartime, but it should be the exception rather than the rule. Finally, the primary reason for Japan's failure was the lack of emphasis on intelligence work. Having a gigantic and well-prepared fleet is excellent, but it's useless if your soldiers operate with unconfirmed information and your messages are intercepted by the enemy. For all these reasons and more, the American victory at Midway remains a fascinating and pivotal chapter in World War II. Thus, we reach the end of the video. If you enjoyed this content and want to continue learning about the most important conflicts of the 20th century, we invite you to subscribe and enable notifications on our channel. Without further ado, we bid farewell until the next installment of Military History. Thank you for joining us.